Sorry I couldn't be with you today. I hope you're enjoying the conference, but what I've done, and hopefully this will be okay, is to put together a PowerPoint presentation with my commentary over the top. As you can see, the title of this paper is Hemispheric Reconfigurations in Greater Amazonia, the Three Guyanas Amid Regional Change and Brazilian Hegemony. Our starting point really is an event which took place on the 29th of November 2010 in Guyana, and they hosted the fourth summit of the new regional movement, the Union of South American Nations, or UNISOR. This in itself was remarkable, yet that day was significant in other respects too. First, it witnessed the coming together of major Latin American presidents, many of them long-serving leaders with large personalities and deep reservoirs of influence. Second, the location of the meeting in Georgetown and the fact that it was taken so seriously by the key players suggested two things: that Guyana has now become more a South American country than a Caribbean one, and that UNISOR itself is emerging as the vehicle for a radically different kind of regionalism, something which has been reinforced by the group's increasing institutionalization, along with the scope and ambition in its remit. Finally, the event included one of Lula da Silva's final speeches as Brazilian president before leaving office, in which he painted a vivid picture of his own country's dramatic growth and expansion over his 2 terms, along with the demonstrable increase in power Brazil now has to shape regional and international agendas. Indeed, what was particularly striking to anyone present was the sight of the Brazilian delegation. In a room that had held barely a couple of hundred people, Lula was flanked by dozens of technical and political personnel. The other leaders, by contrast, had small teams of just a handful. So that is the context. And the three Guyanas are placed within this quite clearly. And they are sort of the edge of politics, both within the Caribbean and in Latin America. So the three Guyanas are simultaneously Caribbean and Latin American countries apart. They are socially, economically, culturally and politically contiguous with an island Caribbean region for which they are geographically isolated. Yet they are physically tied to a continent from which they have long been culturally and linguistically alienated, in large measure because of the enormous barrier that the Amazon rainforest has historically represented. However, these boundaries are now beginning to break down as a whole series of processes begin to make themselves felt, complicating the Guyana's relationship with each other, the wider Caribbean and Latin America as a whole. Another factor within the presentation, of course, is the rise of Brazil, but also the long-standing institutions of integrated governance that seem to be undergoing a process of disintegration in many cases. And finally, the presentation focuses on regionalism, regionalization, hegemony, and the new patterns of regional integration that are impacting on the three Guyanas. So first, some of the underlying trends to consider. First, the limitations of so-called new regionalism. Now, new regionalism was driven in large measure by the acceptance, whether willingly or otherwise, of neoliberal norms around the world, and the belief that market integration on a regional scale would leave groups of countries better able to deal with the exigencies of globalization. Yet this has not occurred in many places, including the Caribbean, where structural asymmetries and extenuating levels of economic divergence are increasingly evident. Consequently, as liberalization has not delivered the expected gains, much of the political will has drained from the traditional integration process, such as the pausing of the Caribbean Single Market and Economy, the CSME, and actors have looked elsewhere for alternatives. It also, the idea of new regionalism, neglects the more diffuse elements of regional projects, of which one is the increased importance of non-state actors in constituting and driving forward more informal processes of integration. Brazilian migration to the Guyanas being a good example. Second, the complex patterns of regional integration. The sheer complexity of contemporary regionalism in terms of both the number of regional projects and the wide variety of actors with a stake in them is quantitatively and qualitatively different to previous eras. We have more regions today with different rationales operating at different levels, and many societies or parts of societies are enmeshed within them in highly complex overlapping ways. And this leads into the deterritorialization of regionalism. That regionness does not need to be geographically fixed. increasingly regions may take different forms and overlap simultaneously within and beyond the same geographical space. And the final set of issues around Brazil's role as a regional hegemon. There are clear, varied forms of influence, and it is quite uneven in many cases. Brazil's role cannot simply be measured in the kind of language of raw material power that has historically been accompanied debates about hegemony. If Brazil's increased influence over the region in general, and the greater Amazonian space in particular, is anything, it results from the deployment of a subtle form of power, which is not necessarily always state-based, wielded by numerous actors and forces, and it is not always easy to grasp. Brazilian influence is also uneven. The way it manifests itself in the building of regional arrangements, economic investment, formal diplomacy, and of course more diffuse processes like migration of Brazilians and the attendant cultural expansionism, all play out in distinct and complex ways. In this sense, the effects of Brazil's attempts at consensual hegemony are often ambivalent, ambiguous and partial. It has remained detached from certain regional developments like ALBA, therefore acquiescing to alternative ideological arrangements rather than challenging them. It has been extremely active in forcing the pace of integration in others, such as the Southern Common Market or Mercosur, and underpinning most regional activity has been a firm preference for leading in areas that help it achieve its global ambitions, such as permanent membership of the UN Security Council. So what are the new patterns of regional disintegration in Latin America and the Caribbean? So as I said before, the three Guyanas occupy a notably ambiguous position within what are increasingly complex processes of regional change. They are gradually becoming disengaged from a Caribbean region with which they share a historical and cultural affinity, while simultaneously deepening their ties with new alliances in Latin America. And this is largely a reflection of the changing pace of integration across the two overlapping regions. Caribbean mechanisms are in decline, while new arrangements located on the continent are proceeding at some pace. But it is also a function of both their unique geographical location between the Amazon rainforest and the Caribbean Sea, both of which are traditionally significant barriers to cross-border engagement, but which, in the case of the former, has become more permeable, and their ties with Brazil that are becoming progressively more important. I deal with the question of Brazil on a subsequent slide. As a prelude, I want to substantiate the claim regarding emergent powers of regional integration and disintegration, and discuss how the Guyanas fit into these configurations. CARICOM's links are clearly weakening for Guyana and Suriname, although in the case of French Guiana there are few links to begin with. Guyana historically has been a key player in the CARICOM process since the mid-1960s, and some progress was made in the early days of CARICOM in terms of furthering regional integration. But more recently, CARICOM's progress towards deeper integration has been disappointing. Since 2001, for example, the key component of neoliberal era integration, the Caribbean single market and economy, has been effectively dead in the water, and the sense is of an increasingly terminal pattern of decline. Also, as one of few countries with goods and natural resources to sell, Guyana has become frustrated by the limited level of intra-Caribbean trade. Thus, the importance of CARICOM to Guyana is not as great as it once was, or indeed as it could be if there was genuine commitment to the integration process. In Suriname, meanwhile, formal engagement with Caribbean regional institutions has been more recent and more hesitant, largely because of the different historical, cultural and linguistic influences of the country. Suriname was the first non-Anglophone country to join CARICOM in 1995, although it had been an observer since 1982. But the move was not universally welcomed. Supporters felt it was important in advancing the decolonisation process, reducing dependence on the Netherlands and improving competitiveness and access to international donor financing. But many in the local business class were worried about greater economic liberalisation and competition. Indeed, the impact of membership has been mixed. According to the Inter-American Development Bank, Suriname's macroeconomic environment has stabilised, but a number of barriers in trade, labour markets, financial services and other sectors remain. In addition, because Suriname is not part of the Commonwealth, it remains somewhat distant from the region as a whole. From Suriname's perspective, the main advantage of belonging to CARICOM is not its market, but rather membership itself, which embraces and enhances the country's place on the regional stage, as well as providing a link to the European Union. Meanwhile, the position of French Guiana is quite different to its neighbours, with only a very limited level of integration with the wider Caribbean. This has a lot to do with its status as a French overseas department, or DOM. Its key institutional, financial and trading relationships are with France and the EU more broadly. It is also much smaller in population terms, a third the size of Guyana and half that of Suriname, but it is also much wealthier, with a GDP per capita 4 or 5 times higher due to metropolitan subsidies and its status essentially as an offshore centre for European space exploration. Links with neighbours are therefore minimal. There are no direct flights to independent islands, and even connections to Martinique and Guadeloupe, the other DOM in the Eastern Caribbean, are limited. So overall, although there have been some advantages, the glacial pace of integration within CARICOM has meant that even Guyana is wondering whether the region remains the best forum to further its interests. These doubts come at a time, of course, when both Guyana and Suriname are engaging actively on the continent, with UNASUR, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, and Mercosur. But particularly Mercosur has the greatest potential for cooperation. Established in 2008, UNASUR has an explicit mandate to bring the region closer together, primarily via infrastructural development. Other initiatives include creating a single market by the end of the decade, promoting regional security, improving local competitiveness, free movement of people and a common passport, and increasingly attempts to ameliorate access to social goods such as healthcare. Because of its clear policy agenda, ambitious attempts to transcend narrow neoliberal regional settlements of the past, a deep institutional structure and substantial funds supporting it, it is quite plausible that UNASUR's evident attractiveness will lead to it becoming the primary regional interlocutor for Guyana and Suriname. As for CELAC, inaugurated in 2011, there has been much discussion about it becoming the future driver of a more intense process of hemispheric, as opposed to simply regional integration. However, so far little has been achieved. There is no central organising agenda or series of themes underpinning its purpose beyond vague political dialogue, nor is there even a permanent secretariat. In 2013, the Caribbean secured a seat as the 4th member of CELAC's governing troika, to be occupied by whichever country holds CARICOM's rotating presidency. It remains to be seen whether this will fall prey to the infighting that has traditionally blighted attempts to achieve a common Caribbean position on even the most simple of issues. For both organisations, then, the potential is undoubtedly there, although time will have to pass before a real South American future for Guyana and Suriname becomes fully apparent. For French Guiana, regional isolation continues. Neither the territory itself nor France enjoys membership of UNASUR or CELAC, both of which have sought to transcend imperialist relationships, also consciously excluding the US. Paris has nonetheless tried to afford local actors in the DOM more leeway to engage in diplomacy with regional states and institutions. It is the Association of Caribbean States, the ACS, in which this has moved furthest, but arguably this institution has the most to lose from the development of CELAC, undermining its rationale. In any case, French Guiana has not really taken advantage of these opportunities, unlike Guadeloupe and Martinique, which have gained associate membership of both the ACS, the Organisation of Eastern Caribbean States, and are seeking a similar status within CARICOM. Reticence on the part of French Guiana is due to differences in the nature and desires of the local political class in Cayenne versus Fort-de-France and Basse-Terre, relative differences of importance in the roles played by the DOM within France's own strategic global assessment, and relatedly the fact that French Guiana borders Brazil, which, as will be shown, is an infinitely more critical diplomatic partner for Paris than other regional groupings in the Caribbean. And finally, Venezuela has been an important partner for Guyana and Suriname as a part of the Petro-Caribe deal, but now with lower oil prices, the worsening economic and political situation in Venezuela, and the blow-up of the long-standing territorial dispute with Guyana, Venezuela perhaps is less important now than it was 5 years or so ago. So in sum, the broad overlapping regional space between the Caribbean and Latin America is today in a state of flux. New arrangements are emerging in the latter, just as existing ones stagnate in the former, and continental change is progressively encompassing, if not all three Guyanas, then certainly Guyana and Suriname, and therefore reshaping the broader Amazonian space that they share with Brazil in particular, but also Venezuela. Let's move on now to the issue of Brazilian hegemony in Latin America. For much of the 20th century, this was quite patchy, in part because of military rule and the emphasis on import substituting industrialization. More recently, the watchword for Brazil remains multilateralism, and perhaps more particularly reciprocal multilateralism. Servo argues the concept involves two presuppositions: the existence of rules to govern the international order, without which the power disparity will prevail in favour of the great powers, and the joint formulation of these rules so that they will not favour the interests of some to the detriment of the interests of others. These ideas appear to undermine the legitimacy of hegemonic leadership, and they apply equally to Brazil as any other country. Another factor here is that Brazil has had a particular focus in recent years on South America as opposed to Latin America. This is an attempt to perhaps marginalise Mexico and a number of other countries with close ties to the US, and in turn provides Brazil with a group of regional partners that share similar views on a range of domestic and international issues. As Burgess suggests, the goal is to make South America a vibrant market for Brazilian products and a source for the energy resources that the country's economy needs. The importance of South America is already clear in that 80% of Brazil's foreign direct investment is concentrated there. But despite this particular focus on South America, there are even problems here. So Lula's South-South strategy, which prioritised Africa and Asia, did dilute the relative importance of South America, and this has not fundamentally changed under Rousseff. Second, the fractious and differentiated nature of South American politics means that Brazil is not the undisputed leader or representative of the continent. Third, Brazil is apprehensive about sacrificing its national economic autonomy to regional formats. Fourth, bilateral relations are often preferred. Fifth, it is not clear that the nation is willing to be responsible for the burdens of the leadership for the process of regional integration. And finally, since Rousseff became president, there's been a waning in the political dimension of Brazil's approach to the region, and she has, of course, been consumed recently by corruption scandals at home. What about Brazil's relationship with the Guyanas in particular? Now, there were early anxieties in the relationship, particularly because of the leftist politics in Guyana and Suriname. But more recently, the relationship has grown significantly, particularly for Guyana and Suriname. So for Guyana, as you can see, there are a range of positive developments over the last decade in terms of visas, in terms of establishing new cross-border crossings, in terms of infrastructure committees to look in terms of how Brazil and Guyanese infrastructure can be improved and developed further. For Suriname, relations have also intensified in recent years, a high point being the visit of President Lula to Suriname in December 2004. And afterwards, high-level bilateral contacts have resulted in treaties on agriculture, education, public health care, infrastructure, and defence and security. For French Guiana, improving transportation links has also been important. Indeed, French Guiana was the first of the Guyanas to announce the building of a land border to Brazil in 1997. After many delays, it was completed in 2001 and commissioned in 2013. Cayenne's relationship with Brazil is unusual, of course, in that it is largely overshadowed by high politics with Paris. So there are these formal connections which are growing in strength. There are also informal connections too. The lack of border security makes it easy for Brazilians to move to the Guyanas. The estimates of Brazilians living in Suriname vary widely from perhaps 4 to 40,000, based on mining, entrepreneurial activity and service sector workers. There's also growing Brazilian cultural influence within the country too. In Guyana, there's also a flow of Brazilians into the country, especially into the gold and diamond mining industries, and increasingly into the establishment of nightclubs and restaurants in Georgetown. In total, approximately perhaps 70,000 Brazilians live in Guyana, about 9% of the population. The presence of illegal Brazilians, however, is a continuing concern. For example, in 2001, Guyana's Ministry of Foreign Affairs embarked on a short-lived regularization campaign aimed at arresting Brazilians illegally living in the country, while in 2009 the Guyana Gold and Diamond Miners Association asked the government to take action against illegal Brazilian miners who were allegedly having a negative impact both economically and environmentally on the industry. There have also been broader concerns about drug and gun smuggling across the border. However, the authorities of each country have never addressed these concerns in any systematic way. And for French Guiana, also experienced a massive influx of foreign migrants. A decade and a half ago, approximately 1/4 of its population consisted of immigrants, mainly from Suriname, Brazil and Haiti. There could be as many as perhaps 15,000 Brazilians mining gold in French Guiana. And this new demographic reality, as elsewhere, has caused some social, economic and political problems. So the informal and formal connections between Brazil and the three Guyanas are quite extensive, but many gaps remain. Infrastructure is quite poor. One example is the lack of an all-weather road from the Takutu Bridge to Guyana's coast. As Ron Saunders said, until the road is constructed, Brazil still cannot use Guyana effectively for transporting exports from its northern region. There are also limited trade flows, so Brazil is not yet a significant trader with Guyana and Suriname, and there are trade agreements between the countries, but they sometimes do not include the most important areas of trade for Guyana and Suriname. And as a consequence of perhaps lack of government dynamism in these areas, there is a degree of private sector apathy when it comes to furthering these links in the future. So in conclusion, I began by focusing on Guyana's hosting of the 2010 UNISOR Summit and the symbolism of this event. Suriname repeated the feat 3 years later. So it is clear from these acts of summitry that Guyana and Suriname are establishing an important presence beyond the Caribbean and into South America, although their smaller neighbour, French Guiana, less so. By drawing on the concepts of regionalism and hegemony, we have sought to show, firstly, how significant regional configurations, whether through the rise of formal projects like UNISOR or CILAC, or via more subtle and diffuse perceptions on the part of key actors regarding the reshaping of regional spaces, are underway in Latin America and the Caribbean. Amidst the decay of pre-existing regional projects in the Caribbean and the emergence of their more dynamic counterparts in Latin America, at least 2 of the 3 Guyanas are increasingly moving towards a continental destiny. Nonetheless, this process is far from finished or assured. Brazil's role in the Amazon space that it shares with the Guyanas is complex and at times contested due to the numerous stakeholders that are involved and the consequent interlacing of official and more diffuse ways of exerting influence. Further, there are mixed views of Brazil in the 3 territories. Many believe that closer ties with Brazil will precipitate significant economic growth and development, while others fear that Brazil will come to dominate their economic networks, migration patterns, and infrastructural connections. So the verdict is still open as to whether Guyana, Suriname and French Guiana will benefit from the evolving hemispheric reconfigurations and Brazil's geographical proximity. But what is clear is that these countries are at the centre of some very interesting and potentially very important processes of regional and hemispheric change that could revolutionise the way in which they are seen within both South America and the Caribbean. Thank you for your time. I hope you managed to follow this okay. If you have any questions, here is my email address and I'll be happy to answer any queries that you might have. Thanks a lot and enjoy the rest of the conference. Goodbye.